Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. The hope in its construction, we can imagine, was to create a sense of majesty. And for my part, it worked. Every part of taking in that place was transcendent, starting with my first view of it. As I walked around the corner, it felt like I was already standing immediately in front of St. Peter's Basilica, even though I was still half a mile away. That is, thanks in part to its physical grandeur. Though it was built through the 16th and into the 17th centuries, it remains the tallest dome in the world at 448 feet tall. And aside from the sense of sheer magnitude, I was also taken in by the staggering scope of work required to build such a structure without modern machinery. No wonder it took more than a century. Finally, approaching and entering the building did nothing to restore my breath. The marble terrazzo floors were so stunning that I almost forgot to notice the masterpieces of sculpture and painting lining the walls of the side chapels, pieces made by the most famous names in Renaissance art. And even still, with all the beauty at or below eye level, my gaze was somehow drawn instinctually up to Bernini's Baldachin, that 5-story bronze canopy over the high altar. Yes, up that high, but higher still, up into the dome, where a gilded image of cherubs surrounding the image of God's presence in the form of a dove, and sunlight streaming in through the oculus to illumine all of what is happening on the floor below. From the moment I saw that space from half a mile away, my focus was drawn beyond the building as it stands, to the hands of those who so long ago built it, and to their motivation. Beyond the art, to the art's creators, and to their creator. Beyond the oculus, to the heavens themselves. Beyond the altar, to the one who inspired it all. If worship can take the form of architecture, then St. Peter's Basilica must surely be the highest of the form. No expense spared. The finest art, the grandest space, gilded and glinting, standing there for anyone to behold. Majestic. As I had taken in all that I could of that place, I started my trek back. I made my way through St. Peter's Square, under the watchful eyes of those stone saints atop the colonnade, down the street extending out from the square, full of shops and Vatican administrative buildings. While I was still in the shadow of that majestic dome, I came upon 2 men sitting on the steps outside a building. Both of them poorly kempt. Both looked very tired. As I passed them, my eyes connected with theirs, and there was something transcendent about that moment, too. One of them asked a question in Italian. I didn't fully understand, but I got the meaning all the same. I shared some of the euros that I had with me, hoping that they would find a meal or a resting place or some comfort that evening. I knew that just a few square feet of all that property I had just taken in had enough value to feed them both and their children, if they had any, and their children's children for generations to come. What attention! I can't say that I'm sorry that those buildings are there. I can't say that I'm sorry expenses go into creating spaces and experiences and moments of transcendent worship everywhere, but that's expense that could go into supporting the poor and eliminating poverty. Even as far back as the penning of sacred Christian texts, this tension has been felt. We've encountered today a story in John's Gospel that is present in varied forms in the other three Gospels as well. The story pits, on one hand, Mary's extravagant gift of expensive perfume being used to clean Jesus' feet, up against the idea that this extravagance would have been better spent on behalf of the poor. And that story still resonates through this community of worship, this community of service, this community of ours. This story still resonates through it today. In 1,000 ways and on a routine basis, we decide either thoughtfully or passively whether we will emphasize the worship of God or service to and for God's beloved. We decide that financially. We decide that in the way we allow or encourage our buildings to be used. We decide that based on how we plan our faith formation activities. We've even had to weigh the tension between worship and care for the vulnerable in the way we respond to a global pandemic. Who saw that one coming? But it isn't all collective. You make choices individually between worship and service when you give of your time and your resources and your energies to this faith community, as opposed to, say, another charity. Yes, of course, we hope and pray that we are participating in the redemption of our wider community. But you know, when contributing here, at least some part of what you've given will go to sustaining this community. Meaning, yes, our service to others, but also to our fellowship and to our education and our worship and, yes, to keeping up our buildings and grounds. To be sure, worship and service are not always pitted against one another. They are not mutually exclusive. But when they are, how are we supposed to choose? Read between the lines. In this particular case, John actually gives us what's between the lines in the form of a parenthetical statement. John places the objection over the use of the perfume on the lips of his would-be betrayer, Judas. And John is the only gospel writer to suggest that Judas has an ulterior motive. John tells us that Judas is a thief of a treasurer and wanted the gift to be liquidated so that he could get his hands on the profit. Thief may very well be an appropriate word, but we don't have here the case of one who absconds with the whole of the community purse. The narrator here seems to know that Judas was dishonest with the group's holdings, but the group does not seem to be aware of it yet. That probably means we have here one who skims off the top, one who takes his cut, and certainly enjoys the benefits of holding the coin for the group. To say all of that another way, Judas was a beneficiary of the activities of Jesus far more than he was a contributor to them. This was his sin. But hold that thought. John goes on to tell us how Jesus responded to Judas's objection. Jesus himself doesn't even address Judas's ulterior motive. He simply addresses the tension between an act of worship, that is, an extravagant gift of perfume to Jesus, and an act of service, selling the perfume for the benefit of the poor. If we don't read carefully, it might sound like Jesus prefers the act of worship. But his concluding words, "You always have the poor with you," are the beginning of a quotation from Deuteronomy 15, which John's audience would have been familiar with. The rest of that statement in Deuteronomy is, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. In so saying, Jesus has affirmed the act of worship and the act of service. He has destroyed our tension. But in its place, he has set up a new tension. You remember the sin of Judas, don't you? His was the sin of being a beneficiary of the work of Jesus without being much a participant in it. He was a theological consumer. John has set the new tension between an active form of worship and a consumerist form of following Jesus. The implication of where we belong on this progression is clear. Worship and service are false alternatives. They simply coexist, two sides of the same coin. But a form of discipleship which asks, what's in it for me, has nothing to do at all with true discipleship. The way of discipleship, the way of being the church, that is, has nothing to do with what we get out of it. It's about what we give into it. And when we give, we worship, as Mary did, preparing Jesus, in a sense, for burial again. And is that not what it means to worship? To participate in and to reiterate the sacrificial love of God in our world? To participate in the death of Christ? To participate in the death is to pave the way for resurrection. So what about those altars of gold? What about those massive churches and costly spaces of worship? Well, I propose that we let Rome worry about Rome, and we'll tend to our own questions. When we gather, are we in search of merely what is fulfilling or enriching us? Or do we gather in the hope of building and sustaining a community that serves and advocates for those whose basic needs go unmet? The specific answers to these and many other questions like them are better answered in community and in dialogue than by a pastor from a pulpit. But one thing we can say here is that as long as our answers to all of those questions are given in extravagant love, then we can't miss. Amen.